Good evening, my name is Brian Gerrish. I used to be a naval officer. I left the Navy in 1993 and set up a small business in Plymouth. And at that stage my life was quite organised and comfortable, and I was doing all the things which people normally do: go to work, have a family life and enjoy the world as it is. But as time went on, I began to notice some things which I thought were rather strange, and I started to realise that in the papers I was reading material which I thought was unusual. I started to see that there was a lot of articles written about the European Union, and overwhelmingly these were very positive, while I saw very little material about the European Union that was negative. And if I did, then usually the articles were tucked away in the paper, they weren't on the front page. But if I go back to about 1994-95, I didn't really know a lot about the European Union. I was only really starting to pay attention to something that seemed to be a little bit more than a group of nations getting together. In the paper I also began to read other articles about people getting involved in a way that I wasn't used to. I began to see articles about the clergy who were helping to put together meetings to promote regional assemblies, and in particular the Bishop of the South West was chairing a meeting to promote the South West Regional Assembly, and I thought this was rather odd that we had senior members of the church becoming active in politics when for years they decided that rather the church should steer clear of mainstream politics. I also began to see things that were talking about crime, and you read some articles and you couldn't help but get the feeling that things were somewhat on their head, that we were seeing the victim victimised whilst the perpetrator of the crime seemed to be getting off lightly or even leaving the courtroom smiling. And certainly to an observer like myself, you would feel that the justice for which Great Britain was known had changed. School children were not to be left out of the loop, because now school children were being taught all manner of things with political correctness. It had become a crime for children to play conkers, or a health and safety issue. And we were also seeing children being pulled into a world of political correctness in what they did. And I was curious as to where this change in direction had come from, but there were certainly no answers in the paper. As time went on and I began to get more interested and I began to ask questions, I started to meet other people who would talk to me about what they knew was going on. And those people, particularly the ones who were well read, started to talk of basically a plan to undermine British society. And that plan was to attack all of the main institutions and pillars of our society. So those who previously we'd looked to with respect as pillars of society were then starting to come under ridicule, whether it happened to MPs or senior members of the police or senior members of the civil service. But you started to get an uneasy feeling that things which had stood us in good stead for a long time were starting to be gently pulled apart. I became more curious, and over a period of time I started to get very interested in what was the seat of power, how were these changes being made. Now, one of the things that was easy to see is that if you picked up publications, you could often see that they had a heavy political agenda, and that might be literature that was meant for school children, where you would find documents supposedly talking about history, but clearly talking about the benefits of the European Union. Sex education had become very broad, and in general very young children, increasingly young children, were being encouraged to know and learn and perhaps experiment in sexual practices that many of us would regard as not desirable. So somewhere there had to be people who were actually putting together the literature and deciding that our society was to go in a new direction. But who were those people? That was the thing that I had to learn. It started to come out slowly, but with more and more research, a picture began to emerge and certain names began to crop up. I began to become aware of the Fabians. Now, some people have heard of the Fabians. Many people regard them as a harmless socialist club where people get together to discuss the socialist view on life. But if you take a look at the Fabian logo of a wolf in sheep's clothing, you begin to realise that perhaps there's something more sinister at work in the Fabian society, particularly when you see another logo that they particularly like using, which is two men hammering the world into a new shape. Perhaps they're hammering our society into a new shape. So behind the scenes, whilst most people look at society and think it rumbles on in a normal way, with normal politics, with two main parties, and perhaps one side party, the Lib Dems, and a few other so-called extremist parties, as they're labelled in the mainstream press, people believe that their world is governed in a very organised way. When you dig deeper and you start to take the lid off it, you begin to realise that it isn't the mainstream parties which are driving our society, but individuals within those parties and the people who pull their strings outside them. I stumbled across an organisation called Common Purpose, and I was intrigued to find that in my city a charity was working amongst every sector of society. It was there in the hospitals, the police, it was there in the schools, it was in the local council, the police, the military, and I'd never heard of it. Now, some of you will know that I've produced a variety of information, and we have a new CD, or DVD rather, which is talking about Common Purpose, and that is a 1 hour 55 minute presentation. But tonight I just really want to touch on the main things as to why this organisation is so interesting. Common Purpose is a charity which talks about change. It's interested in changing our lives. And what it is saying is that the old society that we knew, which was stable, we had a justice system, or it might not have been perfect, but it worked. We had an education system that produced people with sufficient knowledge and wisdom to go on and succeed in their lives, that many of those areas needed to be changed. And Common Purpose, although a charity, was going to set out in our society to change our lives. How does it do it? Well, Common Purpose is very clever because basically it encourages people to step into areas which seem quite reasonable. It says that if you're in a job as perhaps a county councillor or a policeman or a nurse, it might be particularly good for you to mix with other people and hear what they do in their job. And so Common Purpose will bring people together to break people out of their silos, to learn about other people.